I think a lot of people have forgotten that Jeffrey Epstein's death in prison happened during the first Trump administration. So anything that would be released that would suggest that something unusual happened the night that he died would come back to roost for the previous Trump Department of Justice and presumably former Attorney General William Barr. And somehow a lot of people have forgotten that. Well, I guess the easiest way to answer that is just to point out that in the 2024 campaign, there was a lot of signaling, not just from Trump, but from, J.D. Vance and some of these other figures, some of Trump's children, on social media, and I believe also interviews, basically promising the release of Epstein documents if Trump were to be elected. And this is also true of things that were stated by the current FBI director and FBI deputy director. And, a few months before things really exploded with Trump getting kind of feisty on his social media posts, we had, Kash Patel and Dan Bongino and sort of basically come out and say Epstein definitely killed himself and all this stuff. And then Pam Bondi, kind of followed suit. And then they released this video that has a minute missing, which obviously, is going to make people that think Epstein didn't kill himself, or at least didn't kill himself without help from the outside, it's not going to put any conspiracies to rest if there's like a minute plus missing and then the metadata shows that the video was edited. And so there's been all this backpedaling, but it's very bizarre they would mishandle this so extensively. I mean, maybe they thought that the base didn't really care that much, or that they could distract them with something else eventually if they never had the intention to release these things, which is what seems to be the case. But now, I think now they're trying to use the distraction or develop new distractions, as soon as this kind of boiled over and really kind of splintered and angered a large segment of Trump's base. There were releases of, documents on the MLK assassination, and Tulsi Gabbard has now been releasing stuff on Russiagate, and Trump is putting all this stuff like AI videos of Obama getting arrested. So now it's kind of trying to shift gears and get the base riled up about something else and be like, please forget about the Jeffrey Epstein case. But it's really bizarre, particularly the most bizarre of it all would be Trump's own response. He obviously fails to understand how a large segment of his base feels about this case by trying to, wash it away and call it a Democrat-invented hoax and all of this stuff. My opinion generally is that some figures in the Trump administration were kind of chosen as a PR move and that they're not actually in charge of what they're nominally in charge of. So like Pete Hegseth, head of the Pentagon, he's kind of a Fox and Friends, he's a TV show host. And the deputy director of the Pentagon, Steve Feinberg of Cerberus Capital, is most likely the person actually running the Pentagon, not Hegseth, in my opinion. And I think that's true also for RFK Jr. in charge of HHS. I don't really think he's running. He's just kind of this figure that connected with Trump's base, particularly during the COVID era, and made them think reforms would come. And those reforms haven't really come, but he's kind of there to give the impression that things have changed. But the person behind him, the deputy secretary, is Jim O'Neill, who's a career affiliate of Peter Thiel, who's also the power behind J.D. Vance and, the man that made Palantir what it is. And so, I think it's just a way of sort of masking the people that are actually running stuff. And I think that's probably true, too, of Kash Patel and Dan Bongino, who were basically out there. They were making the rounds on podcasts and were making these connections and building trust and relationships with the public in Trump's base. But it seems like they're not actually running anything, in my opinion. They're kind of figureheads in a way, and they're willing figureheads. I started a new series, which is called First Friends, which is sort of like a play on, like First Lady. And yeah, the idea is what you said, exploring the possibility of figures close to Donald Trump, still close to Donald Trump, that have unusual, or rather that have never been reported about connections to Epstein, which suggests that, if I could find it, I'm sure the New York Times and these people could have found it too. And why haven't they reported on it, especially if there's blood in the water against their least favorite president, right? So the first person in this series is about a man named Flavio Briatore, who's probably best known for his career as the top guy in Formula One racing in Europe. He's Italian. He's also pretty well known for having dated and been engaged at one time to Naomi Campbell and later fathering Heidi Klum's first child. Lenny Klume. But beyond that, he's a longtime friend of Donald Trump. As I put in the article, there's a video of them together doing the Italian edition of The Apprentice, because, as Trump says in the video, when it was time to bring The Apprentice to Italy, there were lots of people that wanted to star in it, but he only wanted one person, and that was his longtime friend, Flavio, and they talk about their long-term friendship in that clip for those that are interested. But Flavio Briatore has a few unusual links to the Epstein case, which I explore here. And one of them has to do with the Black Book itself. So the Black Book is this book of contacts that are Epstein's, but Epstein didn't necessarily write it. His staff wrote it. And so it wasn't just one staff member. It was a few members of his staff in his Palm Beach residence that compiled this list of contacts. But it was deemed legitimate enough to be used as evidence in Ghislaine Maxwell's trial a couple years ago. So it's considered to give it was then considered to give a relatively accurate portrayal of the time of sort of, frequently contacted figures in Epstein's world during, the particular period of time that the Palm Beach case in particular spanned. And so that book became public. Well, it was originally published and made actually public by the investigative journalist Nick Bryant, who's also known for investigating the Franklin scandal, which is sort of a Reagan-Bush era pedophile scandal involving government officials. And he published that at Gawker, I believe, in 2015, but he came into possession of it sometime, I think, around 2012 or so, he said. But prior to that, the FBI obtained it from Jeffrey Epstein's former butler, Alfredo Rodriguez, who died the same year it was published in 2015. But earlier, he had tried to basically sell the Black Book, initially to one of the victims' lawyers, Brad Edwards, who works with Stanley Pottinger at, forget the name of their law firm, but they're two of the main Epstein lawyers. And so instead buying the book, obviously it's fair that he wouldn't pay the large sum that Rodriguez was asking for it. But Edwards instead tipped off the FBI, basically sicked the FBI on this guy. And the FBI set up a sting operation to buy the book from him, and Rodriguez went to prison, which later Epstein, when he was asked about it, said about the Black Book, he was like, it never should have been published. It was terrible that it was published, but now my butler, my former butler is in prison for, the crime of publishing it. Of course, I'm paraphrasing. That's not a direct quote, but that was essentially what he was saying. So he agreed with, Rodriguez being put away. And it's important to point out that Epstein was an FBI informant during this period. So, there may have been some duplicity there, but again, I don't know. But what's important here is that Rodriguez, and when he tried to shop this book around, he circled names that he said were co-conspirators and material witnesses to Epstein's sex trafficking crimes. So Flavio Briatore is one of the circled names. Alan Dershowitz is a circled name. Leslie Wexner, Jean-Luc Brunel, who is the French accomplice of Epstein that died in prison while awaiting trial in 2022. And then Donald Trump is also a circled name, which oddly enough hasn't really gotten a lot of coverage over the years. Nick Bryant, of course, talked about that, but a lot of people act like Trump was never accused. And then Brad Edwards later went out and said to Derek Brose, when he was interviewed by him, that Trump had actually been very helpful. But of course, Trump and Epstein at that point had a personal falling out. And also Brad Edwards' law partner, Stanley Pottinger, has kind of a suspect history, sort of acting like the Democrat equivalent of William Barr, which is basically a mop-up man for government scandals over the course of his lengthy career as a lawyer working on behalf of the government in the Department of Justice. So there's a lot of question marks there. In the case of Epstein, you're never going to get an affidavit signed by the CIA or Israeli intelligence that they had ties with Epstein. At least not now. Maybe 70 or 80 plus years from now, when everyone involved is dead, we may, get some sort of document release or something like that. But it's unlikely that they're going to just admit to it.
But you did say he was an intelligence asset.
Well, yeah,
Epstein.
I think he was. Well, it's hard to know, again, because it's not like they're going to come clean about it. But yeah, I think an asset is definitely fair to say, at the very least.
So I don't mean to be pedantic. What does that mean?
So I would say in the case of asset, it's someone that intelligence agencies can use, but you're not an agent. You're not necessarily sent on missions from a career operative perspective. But you have let your willingness to be used by a particular agency known, and that they utilize you when you receive some sort of either payment or something else in exchange for your services. Perhaps impunity from prosecution, right? Could be something else. So
Do you think that that's part of why and how Epstein managed to acquire such a massive fortune?
Yeah, but we'll get to that later, because another one of my main points is that I think Epstein's financial crimes are just as important as his sex crimes, and there's been a huge cover-up, not just of the sex crimes, which is what people are focusing on, but even bigger is the cover-up of his financial crimes. But what I was trying to get to is the fact that we're never going to get an open blanket admission from these intelligence agencies of their involvement with Epstein because of the reputational damage that would cause, and perhaps, congressional scrutiny into their affairs, which the CIA has been carefully avoiding ever since the Church Committee in the 1970s, right? So instead, it's my job to compile all of these details. And when you look at how many of them there are and all together, it's very hard to write them off as coincidental. And what I just laid out on here, with Trump, which is just a small segment of time we're talking about in his career, there's a lot of affiliations to mob figures and to figures like Maxwell or the Rothschilds that have some sort of state connection to Israel that are significant and should be considered, especially if Trump was bailed out by a particular banking interest and owes his career that followed to them. Right. And it's worth pointing out, too, that in that same period of time, Maxwell was working on behalf of Rothschild interests in Wall Street. He was essentially sent from Britain to New York City, and Ghislaine Maxwell followed him to establish a foothold there. And he was because that particular Rothschild bank had interests in doing mergers and acquisitions in Wall Street. And this is all in a New York Times article from the time, and that they had chosen Maxwell and a figure named Jimmy Goldsmith, who's a distant, or I don't know how distant, but a cousin of Rothschild's, who was also a known corporate raider of the 80s, to establish a foothold for them in New York by doing M&As. So it's also worth pointing out Goldsmith is probably the earliest figure in this network that has ties to Epstein, since Epstein was hanging out at his mansion in the early 70s when he was not even employed at the Dalton School yet, and was just like a college dropout that went backpacking to Britain and then came back, and then he's at Jimmy Goldsmith's house in New York. It doesn't really make a lot of sense.